Shields up, Ironbreakers. Welcome back to Dragon's Dogma 2, and in today's video I'm going to be going over all the vocations in the game. For those of you that are not aware, vocations in Dragon's Dogma 2 are the class equivalent from other RPGs. These are going to dictate the playstyle that you're going to be experiencing as you play the game, as well as the playstyle that you can experience for your pawn, because you're going to be choosing a vocation for yourself, as well as a vocation for your pawn. Now, do understand that neither of these choices is a permanent choice. This is just your starting vocation, and then you can swap vocations whenever you feel like it. Now, if you've been researching information about the previous Dragon's Dogma game, you might be wondering, well, what about this whole thing that people talk about, that depending on the vocation that you play, it's actually going to level up different stats, and then if I play as a warrior and I want to swap to a mage, I'm going to be missing out on damage and all of this stuff. That is a system from the original Dragon's Dogma, and it is not present in Dragon's Dogma 2 from my experience up until this point, and I have played a decent chunk of the game so far. Fundamentally, in this game, each vocation has its own set stats, and they do level up as you level up, but whenever you change vocations, the base stats change to suit that vocation. So you don't really have to worry about leveling up as a sorcerer or a warrior to maximize your damage for whatever vocation you actually want to be later. That is something that was a system that was in the original, that is not present in this one. You can just swap vocations whenever you feel like it, assuming that you actually unlock all of them, which, by the way, not all of them are available at the beginning of the game. So let's start by talking about that. At the beginning of the game, you're going to have access to the fighter, the archer, the thief, as well as the mage. All of the other vocations are going to be locked. However, very early on, it's easy to unlock the warrior and the sorcerer. If you just follow the main story quest a little bit, very quickly characters will tell you, hey, can you just do this quest for me and we'll get this thing unlocked, and you can very easily get these two done. However, the next ones, you're actually going to have to go out into the world and find them, and I'm not going to spoil at this point where they actually are. So those other vocations are going to be the Magick Archer, the Mystic Spearhand, the Trickster, as well as the Warfarer. These are more advanced vocations, and these are also vocations that are only available to your main character. Your pawn cannot become a Magick Archer, a Mystic Spearhand, a Trickster, or a Warfarer, at least to the best of our ability so far. Now, I've also heard from people that they believe there might be hidden vocations in the game. I am not saying that that is not the case. What I can tell you as the game is that the game director, Hideaki Itsuno, has said, no, the 10 vocations that we've announced so far are the 10 vocations that are in the game. So at this point, that is all we know. Personally, I haven't even found all of the vocations yet, but I'm well aware of how most of them played because I've experienced them during the preview period, and I actually got to mess around with them, play with different skills, and all of that good stuff. Now that we've went through all of the basic information about vocations, let's go ahead and talk about the concept of advanced vocations versus basic vocations, because this is a misconception that we've also had in the original game, and that was the misconception that the base vocations like fighter, archer, thief, and mage are just stepping stone vocations to then go on to the more advanced ones like warrior, sorcerer, Magick Archer, Mystic Spearhand, so on and so forth, right? But the reality is that is not the case. Each of these vocations is a class on its own. The thing is, the more advanced vocations are more complex to play, but this doesn't mean that they are necessarily better. At least that is not the intent, and assuming that the balance is done properly, they shouldn't just be flat out superior. But obviously, very much like weapons in Monster Hunter, that is likely going to be the case. Whether they end up being superior on the advanced side of things or on the base side of things, we actually don't know at this point. We're going to need more data when the game actually releases. Now, one of the vocations that I would say is definitely the most advanced one is going to be the Warfarer, because that is actually going to allow you to swap between other vocations, which is an interesting concept. We're going to be diving a little bit further into that when we get to it, but just be aware that these are your base vocations, your advanced vocations, and then, like, I don't know, let's call it the super advanced vocation of the Warfarer. You can even see that in the website here. You have different borders for each of these types of vocations. Now, let's get started by talking about the fighter, which is one of the base vocations. It's actually a very good vocation, in my opinion, particularly because you can get some very good augments out of it. You guys might be wondering, what exactly are augments? So, Each vocation has a set of 5 augments. I don't know if you actually get more as the game progresses, but at the beginning of the game you get 5 augments per vocation, and augments are essentially cross-vocation passive skills. So you can acquire augments from fighter and then use those in something like an archer, which is, might be good, might be bad, depending on the type of character that you're trying to do. But this basically goes across all the vocations. So you can basically get augments from Trickster and use them on your thief. You can get augments from Mage and use it on your fighter. And interestingly enough, there's actually a Mage augment that can be useful for the fighter. So that's actually a really nice thing. But yeah, augments is going to be important, and augments is probably going to be one of the reasons why you'll want to level up more than one vocation. Because while you can, if you want to, just know, I want to be an archer and I just want to play the archer and that's that. That's all fine and good. But I'm not going to tell you that there's probably not some really good augments that you can get elsewhere. So, I'll also try to point some of those out. Naturally, at this point in time, I don't know every single augment and every single skill, but I'll try to point out the few ones that I know. Now, as I was saying, we're going to be starting here with the fighter. So the fighter is your basic sword and shield class. A lot of people are going to say, oh, this is just a tank, straight up a tank. And it is going to be a class that can tank for you. As a matter of fact, it is the class that has the augment of provocation, which is something that generates more aggro than other classes. That is an augment that you can then place in other classes should you wish. So yes, in a lot of ways this is designed to be your tank, but that's not to say that he cannot be used as a damage dealer, because he most definitely can, and that most likely at some point I will do a playthrough of Dragon's Dogma 2 with a fighter as a pure damage dealer, and that's probably going to be a blast. At least that's what I would expect. But yeah, fighter, pretty standard class, sword and shield. Not really a whole lot to it. You already know if this is the type of class that you want to play. Now, some of the useful skills that he has a skill called Springboard, which initially you might look at it and think like, oh, why is that a useful skill? But Springboard is essentially something that you can position yourself in a way that you can launch a pawn, or a pawn can position themselves in a way that they can launch you. And while initially this has its uses in combat, so for instance, if there's a really big monster and you want to be pushed up in a position where you can actually grab onto it, stab it, do a bunch of different things, having this skill is going to be useful, but it is also useful out in the world, because sometimes there might be chests that are out of your reach, and you can tell your pawn, hey, you give him the command go in the general direction of that chest, and if the pawn has springboard, he might put himself in a position to throw you up in order to go get the chest, or vice versa. You can use the springboard to launch the pawn up there to go get the chest. So that is one of the useful skills of the fighter. It's a multi-use skill, as you can imagine, because, it can be used both in combat as well as for traversal and other mechanics, which is really cool. Another thing that the fighter has is he also has shield summons, which allows you to basically draw aggro from enemies. So beyond the passive skill that he also has an active skill that actively taunts enemies to come at him, making him kind of like a default class for just having a tank. In my opinion, the fighter synergizes pretty well with every other vocation, with the exception potentially of the Trickster, even though that is something that, I'll have to test a little bit further, because fundamentally the Trickster has its own aggro mechanics by using an illusion of smoke. So he can kind of like take aggro away from the fighter, thus limiting its ability to be a tank, but at that point you can also just build the fighter to be a more damage-dealing powerhouse. The vocation mechanic of the fighter is blocking and parrying. He is the only class that can block damage using a physical shield, and he can also do that in a way which it parries enemies, and if he happens to be enchanted at the time, which is a mage buff, he can also deal elemental damage as he parries and as he blocks, which can be very efficient, as you can imagine. But overall, a lot of his kit is built for tanking, but he can also dish out some decent amount of punishment if built correctly. Like, for instance, one of the augments that you might want to use if you want to build him for more damage would be the final augment from Thief. This would mean that you would have to rank up a Thief to max level, and then you would get an augment that would increase your strength, which obviously is going to increase your damage. That's the fighter. Overall, pretty good class. Synergizes very well with most of the other classes. Good stuff. Now, from the fighter, we're going to be jumping over to the warrior, and the reasoning behind that is because likely if you're trying to play a melee class and you're wondering if the fighter is going to be for you, the next thing is going to be, well, what about the warrior? Do I want to be playing a warrior or a fighter? Because these are two classes that it's kind of like, in a lot of ways, a lot of people just assume, oh, the warrior is the natural progression of the fighter because it is the advanced version of that vocation. But the reality is these are simply two different classes. The fighter is going to be using sword and shield, whereas the warrior is going to be using big two-handed hammers. This also means that the fighter is able to attack faster and also defend faster, whereas the warrior has a lot more animation commitment and is going to require a certain degree of mastery to understand the moves that your enemies are doing so that you can position yourself effectively to land big charged attacks against your enemies. Now, the warrior is actually a lot more fun in Dragon's Dogma 2 than he was in Dragon's Dogma 1 because they've added a lot of new mechanics to it. So the vocation skill of the fighter is going to be the ability to block. Now, the warrior is not going to block with his big two-handed weapon. Instead, he's just going to shoulder charge through damage. This means that whenever damage is about to come at you, you can press the vocation skill action, which is a shoulder barge, and you're basically just going to power through the damage. Now, this is going to be very dangerous because while naturally the warrior is going to have a high level of defense whenever he's in that shoulder barge, he's still going to take damage. So you're going to have to really build him up to be very tanky. So maybe you'll even want to get some augments from the fighter, which comes with stuff that increases like your physical defense. The mage also has things that increase your magical defense in case you want to tank through magical damage. So there's a lot of other augments that you want to be looking at just to improve the survivability of the warrior, because fundamentally he doesn't really dodge things. There's no universal dodge roll, as I've mentioned in previous videos. He's just gonna tank through everything. But an interesting thing is that the warrior is also designed to potentially be a tank. He also has a skill that taunts enemies. It is called Boisterous Shout or something like that, but it fundamentally serves the same purpose as shield summons. He screams and enemies are going to come at you. There's also skills that allow you to survive a little bit better, but fundamentally the warrior is a big damage dealing powerhouse that can also serve as a tank. He also has a very similar functionality to the fighter in that he can also launch you upwards, very much like Shield Springboard. He has something where he puts you on his shoulder and then just like yeets you up if that is something that you need to do. So he can kind of fill in the same role as the fighter. The thing here is, fighter is easier to play, warrior is more complicated to play. Warrior is able to stagger enemies easier, whereas the fighter is able to defend himself better. So it's kind of like a more offensive version of the fighter that also has much higher animation commitment and a greater degree of skill needed to play. So, but at the same time, he's also tremendously fun. In terms of classes that would synergize well with the warrior, I would say that most classes also synergize well with the warrior because he kind of just fills that role of being the brawler that's on the front line, trying to take up aggro and dishing out damage. But you can also build him strictly for damage and not giving him that much tanking abilities, and then just use a fighter as your tank if you want to be focused on, no, I want to be a big, meaty warrior that focuses more on damage as opposed to tanking. That is definitely something that you can do. Or if you really want to, you can even have two warriors and build one of them more defensive and one of them more offensive. But these are things that I would definitely recommend. Now, one of the things that I would also want to have in a party with the warrior would be a mage, because the mage has the ability to heal you. And since you're going to be taking damage pretty much unavoidably as the warrior, having that mage to fall back on to give you heals as well as enchant your weapons is going to be something that I would highly recommend. Mage is also going to be very good when paired up with the fighter, so keep that in mind. But yeah, that's warrior. Big meaty chops. He also has some really cool execution moves. This is like the ultimate guts fantasy in my opinion. Like when you're playing the warrior, you just feel like guts. Minus the cannon arm, which is a damn shame, but whatever. Now moving on, let's go back to the basic vocation of Archer. So Archer is a physical range damage dealer, and it is important to make that distinction. All of the classes that we've talked about so far only really deal physical damage. The reason why this is important is because certain monsters are going to be more vulnerable to physical damage, whereas other monsters are going to be more vulnerable to magical damage. The Archer is also going to fill the role of being a debuffer. As a matter of fact, I think that the Archer is going to make an excellent pawn because pawns don't really need to use as many consumables as the Arisen, I think. At least that's the way that it was in the original Dragon's Dogma. I haven't really played too much Archer, but Archer is able to do things like shoot out tarring arrows. Tearing, I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to be pronounced. Arrows with tar. And the reason why that is a really cool thing is because imagine, for instance, you have a mage or a sorcerer that has fire spells or even fire enchant, and you're shooting out these tarring arrows. Your enemies are debuffed with, they're basically flammable, and you're using fire damage to deal damage on them. That's going to deal more damage. They're going to burn more. It's going to be a good time. You can also use stuff like poison and, basically debilitations all around. I kind of feel like that's the niche that they're trying to get the Archer to fill. Shooting stuff with arrows that debuff, explosive arrows, basically that's kind of like the thing. If you're playing him as your main class, though, you're probably going to be expected to spend a decent chunk of coin in purchasing specific arrows in order to really be able to fulfill the role that is expected of you in the game. But again, this is just based on very preliminary impressions because archery is not really my thing. I haven't played him all that much. But, range damage dealer. And also, he's going to be quite agile from some of the gameplay footage that we've seen, so you should be able to get a decent chunk of distance between you and your targets, and even grapple on and do like some special attacks where you shoot arrows from grapples and stuff like that. But yeah, basically now you might be questioning, okay, so I'm kind of indecisive between the Archer as well as the Magick Archer. And the Magick Archer is going to deal more magic damage, as the name implies. And this is going to be important because, like I told you, some enemies are going to be more vulnerable to physical damage, as is the case, for instance, for the Golem. Now, the Golem is an enemy that actually takes no magical damage, so you need to actually deal physical damage. And the physical damage component of the Magick Archer is going to be limited. So that's kind of like the advantage of having an Archer versus the advantage of having a Magick Archer. But having said that, early reports from people that I've spoken with indicate that the Magick Archer is significantly more potent than the basic Archer, so keep that in mind. Now, classes that would synergize well with the Archer, I mean, anything that tanks to kind of like keep the aggro away from you so that you can just belt your enemies from a distance, whether that is a fighter or a warrior, or even a Trickster, but you have to be the one playing the Trickster, so this would be if your pawn was an Archer. But basically things that can keep monsters away from you, those are always going to be a good thing. Good vocations to level up for augments would be the Thief, because the Thief has the additional physical damage at the end of his tree. The Mage also has something which is at the end of the Mage tree, additional stamina recovery, which I feel is probably going to be very important for the Archer. So keep those things in mind. But yeah, overall, just having a tank in front of you is going to do wonders. Having someone to heal you also can't really hurt. So, but fundamentally, the Archer is that class that does ranged physical damage, and it's going to be useful for flying monsters that are away from you and that are particularly vulnerable to physical damage. So keep that in mind. Again, archery, not really my forte. Now, when it comes to the Magick Archer, because he's going to be focusing more on magic damage, one of the vocations that I would recommend you to eventually level up is potentially the Sorcerer, because at the end, the final augment that you can get from the Sorcerer is going to increase your magic damage, which I predict is going to be very important for the Magick Archer. In terms of classes that you're going to synergize well with, you get your tanks, your fighter, or your warrior. Those I feel are going to be particularly important to keep things at a distance from you. Now, the really cool thing about the Magick Archer is that he can also heal. So if you are playing as a Magick Archer, you don't necessarily need to have a mage, whereas usually having a mage is something that's advantageous regardless of which vocation you are going with. When you're playing the Magick Archer, you can just heal yourself and heal your party. As a matter of fact, the Magick Archer can straight up resurrect dead pawns with one of his skills, which is incredibly powerful, because usually you have to run up to where the pawn is, you have to go ahead and resurrect the pawn, whereas with the Magick Archer, you can just do all of that stuff from a distance, topping that off with all the additional magical damage they can do and all of their spell casting and stuff. This is a really, really powerful class in the game right now, and yeah, it's just good stuff all around. Again, big recommendation, get yourself a tank to deal with the damage and whatnot, and also make sure that you have at least one physical DPS to offset the fact that you're mostly going to be doing magical damage, whether that is a thief if you want to go more melee, or potentially an archer to kind of like help you along with dealing additional physical damage. Now, moving on to the base vocation of the Mage. The Mage in this game is not necessarily an offensive spellcaster, quite the opposite. The Mage almost takes the role of the Cleric in other RPGs. He's going to be the one that has a heal. As a matter of fact, his heavy attack is the heal. It's not even a skill anymore. So he's going to be your de facto healer. He also has boons, which means buffs for your party. He can enchant people's weapons with fire damage, lightning damage, and a bunch of other different damage types, which is really cool. An important thing to know when you are playing as the Mage, if you happen to play this role yourself, or whether you're using this as your pawn, or whether you're recruiting a pawn that is a mage, is it will be good to know which monsters you're planning on fighting and what are their weaknesses. Because if you're fighting a monster that is weak to fire and you bring that fire enchant, it is going to make a world of difference, which is obviously very good. If you're playing as a mage, naturally, once again, having 1 or 2 tanks in your party is never going to hurt. If you are using a mage as your pawn, again, just keep in mind what are the elemental damage bonuses that you want to have. Another really cool thing about mages is that, very much like sorcerers, they also benefit from dual casting. So at the beginning of the game, I actually think that having 2 mages is going to be really cool, because you're going to have tons of heals, and at the same time they can dual cast and cast the same spells and cast them faster than usual, which is also very nice. The mage's special ability is quick casting, which allows him to cast spells faster at the cost of increased stamina consumption. And yeah, mages synergize well with literally everything. Literally anything that you want to have on your party, a mage is going to help, because it can buff, it can heal, it can levitate to get you to places higher. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's the support, the de facto support class, and it is a fantastic class. Now, from the mage, I'm going to go straight to the trickster, because it is one of the things that is the closest to the mage. And the Trickster is essentially a support class. Now, the difference is the Trickster doesn't really deal damage, but the Trickster has aggro mechanics that allow him to fundamentally grab aggro from enemies and use all types of illusions and stuff like that. But the Trickster is such a unique class that I have to recommend that you watch my video dedicated to the Trickster to get a better understanding of how he works. Now, when it comes to Trickster synergies, one of the things that I would definitely recommend is just bring stuff that deals damage. Because the Trickster himself doesn't really do that much damage, but he is able to buff your pawns to deal redonkulous amounts of damage. And because the Trickster has the ability to manage aggro, I don't necessarily think you're going to be needing a tank as the Trickster if you're playing your Trickster properly. But again, this is still based on, you know, my limited experience with the game so far. As I play more and more hours, I might change my opinion on that. But for now, if I was building a party setup for a Trickster, because remember, the Trickster cannot be a pawn. The Trickster is only for your main class. If I was building a party with a Trickster in mind, one of the things that I would definitely do is just like fill it up with all types of damage. So Thief, Sorcerer, maybe even a Thief and 2 Sorcerers, I don't know, or a Thief, an Archer, and another Sorcerer. But basically, I just want stuff that deals a ton of damage. Maybe even 2 Warriors, I don't know, Thief, Warrior. Basically stuff that is equipped to dish out as much punishment as possible, and basically just spam that red buff to get them to deal massive amounts of damage and destroy everything. Now, another recommendation that I would have if you're playing the Trickster, because if I was playing the Trickster, I would actually want to avoid playing the Mage, Now you can bring a Mage and you have that added support on top of the Trickster support, but I would actually try to have pawns that have the Chirurgeon specialization, because that allows pawns to actually use items from their inventory to heal other people in your party. And then I would load up those pawns that have the Chirurgeon ability with healing items so that they heal your party, as opposed to having a dedicated Mage to heal, and then just dish out as much damage as I possibly could with a Trickster. That would be what I would try to do. But again, this is all based on experimentation, what I've seen so far. And the Trickster is quite a unique class. It's a ton of fun to play. I'll tell you that right now. I had a blast playing that class. But anyway, next up we got to talk about the Sorcerer. The Sorcerer is your de facto big boy spellcaster. He's going to, do some of the most destructive and powerful spells in the game. And the interesting thing is that Sorcerer is kind of a selfish class. So the Sorcerer synergizes really well with itself because of the dual casting mechanic. What does that mean? If two Sorcerers start casting the same spell, they're going to basically be able to cast it and at a faster rate, because a lot of the Sorcerer spells actually take a significant amount of time to cast. And because of that, having more Sorcerers in your party is going to reduce the amount of time it takes to cast those spells, which means you can dish out a lot more punishment. So personally, if I was playing a Sorcerer, the other class that I would most definitely want to have on my party is another Sorcerer so that we can dual class. Maybe even 3 Sorcerers. I don't know, because I haven't experimented enough with the Sorcerer up until this point. But definitely if I was playing a Sorcerer, I would have at least 2 of them in my party. Other classes that naturally are going to synergize well with the Sorcerer is going to be any type of tank, so that they can actually take aggro from you, and having a Mage to heal you, because I don't think the Sorcerer has a lot of healing abilities, so you'd have to be relying mostly on items to heal yourself. Which, you can also do that if that is one of the things that you want to do. But probably having at least 1 tank in the party and a Mage would be the way that I would go. So 2 Sorcerers, a tank, and a Mage would probably be the way that I would go. And the tank would probably end up being a Warrior as well. And the reasoning behind that is because you're going to be lacking on physical damage if you've got 2 Sorcerers and a Mage, right? So you want the Warrior because he's probably going to be able to dish out more damage than the Fighter. But you're going to have to really build out that Warrior. That's just my thought when it comes to the Sorcerer. But fundamentally, the Sorcerer is the class that you're going to want to play if you want to see big explosions on screen, big devastating spell effects. Like, it's actually quite unique. If the spells that we get by endgame in Dragon's Dogma 2 are anything like the spells we got on the original Dragon's Dogma, these are some of the best spell effects that you're ever going to see, some of the most destructive spell effects. And because of the way that Vocations work, whereas there's no mana in this game, there's only stamina, and stamina regenerates rapidly, usually, depending on whether or not you've wasted all of it. All of a sudden, now you have to sit and wait. But if you manage your stamina properly, it actually regenerates at a fairly good pace, and there's no cooldowns. Casting spells in this game is an absolute blast. So yeah, Sorcerer is going to be amazing. Now, the Thief is a really cool class that surprised me, because usually I don't really tend to go for the dual-wielding rogue types, but in this game, the Thief also gains access to explosives, which is something that I really enjoyed in the Assassin on the original Dragon's Dogma, which just really made my day. But to top it off, he also has a couple of more interesting tricks, like the Ensnare ability that allows you to both grab Hardpiece from the air as well as trip big targets from a distance. It's just a really satisfying vocation to play all around. Now, I would say that the Thief probably synergizes very well with the Mage, because the Thief attacks very fast because he's got dual-wielding daggers and all of that good stuff, and a lot of his attacks are actually multi-hitting attacks. Therefore, if you synergize that with the Mage is going to enchant your weapons with additional elemental damage. If specifically you get a Mage that has the elemental enchantment that the enemy you're fighting is weak against, the Thief is just going to straight up delete enemies, which is very satisfying, and it is a really cool class fantasy. Once again, I would recommend to get at least like 1 tank, whether that's a Fighter or a Warrior is going to be up to you. So Mage, Fighter, Warrior, and then choose another ranged damage dealer. Most likely in this case, I would go for the Sorcerer, because you already have 2 physical classes, so that would be my party composition if I was going to main a Thief. A tremendously fun vocation that I would highly recommend you guys to check out, even if just to play with the explosives. It is that fun. Now, The vocation that I plan on maining, which is the Mystic Spearhand, this is a combination of the fighter and the mage almost, but basically this is a melee magic hybrid that kind of functions almost like an insect glaive. He is the type of character that is very fast at dealing damage. He is able to deal 2 types of damage, which is cool because you can exploit both the magical weaknesses of some enemies and the physical weaknesses of others. He has a really cool defensive skill in the form of his barrier shield, which I don't remember the exact name. You can AoE shield your whole party, which also gives him a little bit of support. He is basically a Jedi Knight on steroids in a lot of ways and feels absolutely fantastic to play. Now, if you're playing with the Mystic Spearhand, I'd recommend getting one tank, whether that is the warrior or the fighter, because it's useful to not have to deal with aggro so that you can dish out as much punishment as possible. Having a mage for heal also is going to be particularly useful. But other than that, the Mystic Spearhand really can do whatever he wants. Now, a cool thing that I'm planning on doing with the Mystic Spearhand, I'm not sure if this is going to be viable or even necessary, is potentially leveling up a Sorcerer to maximum so that I can get his augment that increases magical damage, and then leveling up a Thief to maximum so that I can get his augment that increases strength, and that way I will get both additional physical damage as well as additional magical damage. And then I'm probably going to get some quality of life stuff like additional stamina from the Archer and the additional weight from the Fighter. There's a lot of good stuff that you're going to be able to get with the Mystic Spearhand, and yeah, he just seems like a super solid class all around. And the other thing about the Mystic Spearhand is that you can really make your party composition however you want. Again, I'd recommend the Mage to heal and one tank, but you don't even necessarily need the tank if you're using your shield properly, but, you know, there's some interesting stuff still to experiment with when it comes to this class, but yeah. Absolute blast, twin blade user, shreds through stuff, ton of fun. And finally, we get to the Warfarer. Now, the Warfarer, which, by the way, in Japanese, they just straight up call him the Arisen, but the Warfarer is a vocation that allows you to swap between other vocations. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this particular vocation. I believe that this is going to be something that you're going to be finding a little bit later in the game than some of the other vocations, which you can probably find significant and, you know, faster. And the reasoning behind that is because I believe that when it comes to the Warfare, you're going to have to unlock the classes that you want to play as, and you're going to want to unlock the skills of those classes and their augments and whatnot, and bring those over to the Warfare. It's important to mention that the Warfare is going to have lower base stats than other vocations, and you know, the reasoning behind that is because you can swap between vocations. Now, at this point, it is my belief that you're going to be able to swap between 3 vocations because that's what they've shown in trailers so far. But because I haven't actually unlocked this vocation in the game yet, I don't actually know that much about it. But basically, you're going to be able to swap between vocations. I know that the swapping is one way, so you're basically going to set up, okay, I want to be, let's say, Warrior, Magick Archer, Mystic Spearhand. That's how it's going to go. So you're going to hit the swap class button or swap vocation button, and you're going to go from Warrior to Magick Archer. Then you're going to go from Magick Archer to Mystic Spearhand. Then you're going to go from Mystic Spearhand to Warrior. Or whatever 3 vocations you want to have. Like, okay, let's say I want to be Thief, Archer, and Fighter. That's how it's going to go. It goes Thief, Archer, Fighter, and then it goes back to Thief, Archer, Fighter, right? So yeah, this is going to be something that you need to keep in mind as you equip the vocation, and as you decide which skills you want to use so that you kind of like set up a chain of skills that actually works in your favor. This is definitely going to be one of those vocations that I want to experiment with, but yeah, it's going to be pretty wild. This is a super advanced vocation, and you're going to have to find the Meister of it and all of that stuff. Good luck with that. Which vocations do I feel will better synergize with this one? I have absolutely no idea, because it all depends on which vocations you choose to include in your Warfare, right? So you got to keep that in mind. If you're including, you know, melee vocations, then you probably want to have some magic vocations to offset the fact that you're just dealing physical damage, right? But yeah, Warfare, unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot yet. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what you can expect out of each of these classes. As per usual, if you enjoyed the video, I really appreciate it if you leave a like. You can subscribe for more Dragon's Dogma 2 content. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay strong, stay safe, peace out.